A substitute teacher that is also an option. So teacher, substitute teacher. There are also positions like volunteering at the bookstore or helping out in the parking lot. And there's various other parts of the Bal Vihar system that we are looking for volunteers. So if you are willing to help out, usually it happens before the class or in between the classes. If you have time to give as seva, we're definitely looking for some help. Please reach out to Ramesh. You saw him today making the announcements. You can reach out to him. He's the coordinator of the first session here. And we are looking for extra help. One other thing is that between these classes, between C1 and C2, there are cultural classes that happen between 10:45 to 11:45. Specifically, we're looking for help with shlokathon teachers. If anybody is comfortable with chanting Bhagavad Gita or have been part of shlokathon themselves and are aware of the system, we're definitely looking for help to find a teacher who can add to this wonderful force to teach shlokathon. So if you're interested, please do reach out to Rameshji. And if you're interested as well and you'd like to inform me at the end of class, I can also take down your name. And we'll make sure to take your name, your phone, and an email so we can contact you. And even if you have questions, you're not quite sure what the responsibilities are, you just want to get to know something, do have a conversation so you can get to understand what exactly those responsibilities are before you commit to it. But we are definitely looking for help. Okay? All right. So today, I wanted to kind of begin with the cultural and Vedic cultural context in which Adi Shankaracharya ji was born into, and because of that context, the great achievements he has given to Hinduism, and kind of build that context before we directly dive into Bhaja Govindam today. We might get there, but we'll see. And I do apologize if in between I start coughing or have to, clear my throat. I have been a little unwell the last week, but I sound worse than I feel right now. So please do excuse me. So Gurudev starts out with an amazing first sentence. He says, an institution, culture, and religion cannot remain permanent. Interesting, right? He says it cannot remain permanent. And there have been various examples of how a cultural has its ups and its downs. We've seen in the Western hemisphere that the Greek civilization has come up. We've heard many great things of the Greek civilization, their stories, their democracy. All of those ideas have been developed so well, and yet they have also perished. Then we have seen the rise and decline of the Roman Empire, the great Roman Empire. Then we've also seen a little further south, the Egyptian Empire. You see in Halloween's about to come up, right? So a lot of people will dress up as Egyptians, in all sorts of cat costumes or, with togas and all that stuff, right? But we treat the Egyptian civilization as perished. We know a lot of their contributions. We know what they look like, the monuments, the Great Pyramids. We respect it. But even the Egyptian Empire has died away. Last example is the Mesopotamian, right? In any school children's social studies textbook, ancient civilizations, one of them is definitely the Mesopotamian civilization. So Gurudev is not wrong in his observations that institutions, cultures, and religion rise and fall like the waves. And yet, Hinduism has had an amazing feature of being able to sustain and survive through this entire time. In fact, he beautifully has an analogy where he says that she has wept to see the other cultures decline, and she has cheered when other religions have arisen. She has watched all of them rise and fall. But what is it about Hinduism that makes it so permanent, almost. Sanatana Dharma is the name that we give Hinduism. What makes it so special? And we've seen, and when you say, okay, is Hinduism really that long? How long do you mean Sanatana Dharma? We've seen the Vedic periods, right? If you sit down to actually calculate how many years is Kali Yuga, how many years is Treta Yuga, how many years is Dwapar Yuga, and how many years is Satya Yuga. I think 5,126 years is how many years we're into Kali Yuga, and Treta Yuga is twice as long, Dwapar Yuga is 3 times as long. It's millions of years. Vedic periods. Then we come into the Puranic age, where we describe Ramchandraji. What was Bharat like during the time when Ramchandraji was at his glory? Then Kali Yuga begins when Bhagwan Shri Krishna leaves this world. But even Bhagwan Krishna used to live not just 100 years, about, I think, 200, 300 years. Swamiji has given that their lifetime during that time was quite long. And even in the last 1,000 years, in recent history, even though there have been so many barbaric Islamic invasions, and the British, the five European countries that have come to loot Bharat, even through those thousands of years of trauma, Hinduism still survives. And you know what's my proof? That Hinduism still survives. You and me. We're in this room right now talking about Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma and continuing to chant Bhagavad Gita, continuing to investigate into Bhaja Govindam, looking into what are the ideas and philosophies of Adi Shankaracharya Ji. The very fact that you and I are sitting in this room having this conversation is proof that Sanatana Dharma has survived over and over and over again since the Vedic periods all the way till today. Undeniable. So although Gurudev makes that statement in the very beginning that an institution, a culture, and a religion cannot remain permanent, Hinduism stands the test of time. And so that must lead us to the next question. How? How is Hinduism able to survive so long? What is so intrinsic about this culture, this religion, this institution that we have that makes it so permanent? In fact, there was a very funny analogy that Gurudev gives about just how well she survives. It almost seems like some historians or even the public thought that Hinduism had died, and they had carried her all the way to the burial grounds. But this old lady at the very last moment would get up and said, "Where am I? Where is it?" And so they would have to bring her back home, give her coffee, revive her. So he has a very humorous way of describing this eternalness of Hinduism. But is it the people? Is it individuals that uphold Hinduism? Is it you and me that uphold it? Not really. Because we've seen that the cause of a religion to decline is also seen in the people that are acting as Hindus. So some of them we see that our practices may decline, who we are and that vulgarity that we sometimes indulge into. We are Hindus trying to practice Hinduism, and yet we decay as a people in our own practices. So there's a curious question as to what is that intrinsic nature of Hinduism that keeps it alive? Because the people change, the values change, the ideas and guidelines change, so it can't necessarily be placed on the shoulders of the practicing Hindus. What about Hinduism that survives? If you were to ask the original gurus, they would tell you that Vedas are not Manushya Prokta. Manushya Prokta, meaning that it is propagated or spoken by man. It's a very important principle. It is apurusheya, that it is that which is given by the gods themselves, Ishvara, Brahman. It's that eternal message that's come from there and not through a man. Now this is a very important point today. Because sometimes we get into this loop of wanting to say that sarva samabhava, that all religions are the same. And we get into this problem. If you were to look at Abrahamic religions, which is Christianity, Judaism, and even Islam, their religion originates or is given by a prophet. That this is the message of God given by a person. And there are no prophets that arise afterwards. If I were to say I am a prophet of Christianity right now, I would be killed. Because that is blasphemy in their religions. To them, it is Purusha Prokta, meaning it is given by a prophet. But the very nature and tenet of Vedas is that it is not given by man, apurusha. So the source of it is Sanatana. And therefore that which arises carries that property of being Sanatana. But if I were to tell you, that, okay, you have to believe that this is from the gods, you have to believe it. Today's intellectualism will bash right up against it. Oh, you're just asking me to believe this blind faith. And so Gurudev says that the only way to touch the heart of the modern man is when the head is broken with logic. That once you break the head with logic, then you're able to reach the heart of man. So let's look at it from an intellectual point of view. Why is this culture Sanatana? So when we look at culture, we cannot say that it declines because the culture is bad. You can't say that. Because the culture itself produces heroes time and time again. So for example, we have in the recent history, within the last 1,000 years, we have so many heroic and valorous Rajputs, Maratha kings. Vijayanagar comes to mind, and Ahomis and Swamis like Vivekananda ji and Gurudev himself. It's funny, as he was writing this, he lists all these heroes, and he stops at Swami Vivekananda, and I'm like, and now I can add Gurudev to this list. So the culture itself has this ability to produce great heroes from this culture. In fact, I'm right now studying on Shivaji Maharaj, and it was amazing to learn that during his childhood, he learned everything that he needed to from his mother, and his mother was teaching him the itihasas, Mahabharata and Ramayana. And so he drew all of the values and techniques of kingdomship, military strategies, everything he needed to know, he learned from his mother because they were studying Sanatana Dharma and the itihasas. A living example. So you cannot say that a culture declines because it's bad, because we have seen that because of the culture, we have rise of great heroes. But there's an important element when the culture is being practiced. And so Gurudev gives a very simple analogy to understand this. In nature, if a species has to survive, it has to learn to adapt to nature. Nature is constantly changing. She's always throwing one hurricane, an earthquake, global warming, whatever it is, right? So she's constantly changing. And it's not that she actively rubs out species. The species has to learn to adapt the way it survives to match the environment that it's encountered. If it cannot adapt, then it will die on its own. So in the same way, the Hindu culture, or any culture for that matter, must learn to take its eternal values and be able to apply it to the time and context in which people are living in. If that adaptability, that flexibility is not there in a culture, then it will perish and be rubbed out just like any of the other species. That is what's missing in other religions. But that is the key hallmark of Sanatana Dharma. So, for example, let's go back to What is a society? A society is made up of individuals. And individuals constantly change. Although we say, oh, it's so, I have a hard time changing, I'm stuck the way I am. But really, if you look at it, we do change quite a bit over time. We're not the same as what we were 7 years ago. So individually, we change. And if society is made up of individuals, then society itself will also change. And if the culture cannot adapt to the way the society changes and keep giving practical, applicable angles for that eternal values, then it will perish away. But if it doesn't change, the way we see it is that the old Orthodox people, or fanatics, are constantly trying to box us and impose the old ways, and that's it. I don't want nothing to do with this religion. That is a phrase that we often hear, and we can hear it with literally every generation. The more you try to tell them, this is how our grandfathers did it, so you have to do it. It's like, nah, we're in a different age now. We're not the same as you. So even generation by generation, if it doesn't change, then the culture will die. And so Gurudev gives us a very important principle that when we talk about religious revival or spiritual renaissance, what exactly does that mean? It is an updating of the culture or the religion so that it can meet the demands of that society at that time. So, an analogy that Gurudev gives is if you compare, it's funny because I'm like just now recovering from a sickness, so it was really funny to see this example come up. But Gurudev says, compare a healthy, hatta-katta, 42-year-old, right, who is pretty well off in his life and he's, maintained his health pretty well, and he gets typhoid. Or let's change the example, he gets COVID, right? At that point, he's had his vaccinations, he's taking care of his wealth, he wears his mask enough, right? And so he gets bedridden for a few days, and the doctor comes and says, okay, take these medicines, they're Ayurvedic medicines, lay down for a week and keep rest, and you'll be fine. First day, fine, he'll religiously take the medicine. He'll go to sleep on time, he'll be in bed watching Netflix the whole day, he's resting, great. Second day is fine, third day is fine. Fourth day, do you find him in bed? No, he's up, cleaning the house, doing something, this or that, going outside, checking the weather, calling the neighbors. That restlessness starts to come out of him. And then the mother, if the grandmother is living in the house, yo, beta, why are you up? Go back to bed. The doctor told you to go to sleep. Yeah, let the doctor come. I'll just go for a walk, and before the doctor comes, I'll go back to bed. That vitality in that young man is that source of overcoming his own sickness. But compare it to a 92-year-old. Gurudev has a funny joke. He said he doesn't even have the energy to die. So if he gets typhoid or COVID, it's a whole different story. You can give him as much bed rest as you can, the most potent medicine that possible. But because the internal system is not able to fight the foreign bodies, it's a very hard road. And it is very much a risk for a 92-year-old. So in the same way, when we bring it back to our culture, is there that internal vitality in that culture that can bring up the antibodies that are necessary that are threatening its demise? Or is it like the 92-year-old that doesn't have that internal vitality to produce the people that it needs to keep its culture alive, that it will perish without its own internal force? You can help it as much as you want, but it won't survive. So which is it for Hinduism? Of course, Hinduism is eternally that 42-year-old. Because if we look through time, we can look at the Vedic age at that point. That at that time, the land was very fertile, and there weren't a lot of people, and so the demands weren't that much. That person could harvest their farm, protect their food, and have a very simple life. Oftentimes, I know some of my uncles or, elder people that I've often talked to, they're like, man, those good old days. I wish I could go back to India, just go back to the farm, simple life. I don't want all this, right? But even then, it won't truly return to the way the sattvic nature of the Vedic periods was. It was easy for someone to be in a calm, peaceful, beautiful, serene environment, and their mind to reflect the same. Therefore, their mind was easy to get into contemplation. They could actually reflect on the Upanishadic messages because their mind was already calm and serene. And therefore, there wasn't much support in terms of sadhana that was required. Now let's move a little bit further in time. These people now became prosperous, the population grew, the pressures and demands on the land itself grew, the competition grows, and therefore the anxieties start to build up. And so now we need more aids. Now, again, the culture is adapting just a little bit. Now we think about rituals. Yajnas and yagas were very elaborate. To bring all your resources together, to have the pandits there chanting the mantras, it's an extensive, laborious, and exhausting process. But in order for the mind to come to focus and keep that strength and virility within that person, Vedic rituals was a very important aspect to it. But then over time, they started to see that, okay, the religious aspect is within these rituals. Once I'm done, I can go and live my life as I want. So that vulgarity starts to come out of life. And so to reconnect back, the Puranic ages had a different take on it. Now, they're encouraging each and every single individual to connect emotionally to their religion. That we need the stories, we need our history, we need icons, we need symbols. We need that to reconnect with the roots of our Sanatana Dharma. That maybe I don't have the capacity anymore or the resources to perform a huge yajna that lasts about 4 or 5 months. So, again, it changed. Now, fast forward a little bit more to the last 1,000 years. Because of all of that invasions, we see that the very resources and autonomy of the Hindu people were ripped away. In fact, when we saw the 5 European nations come in, they literally looted and dried up every last penny that existed in Bharat. There was one researcher who showed what is the GDP of Britain and the European countries, and what is the GDP of India at that time. You literally see an exact, this is India coming down, and this is the Europe coming up, and there's an exact intersection. Why? Because all of these trading companies looted and destroyed the wealth system and took it all to Europe, leaving at least 13 to 15 different famines over 600 years. And recently I was seeing this video where there was a European photographer who photographed the Indian people of Bengal during the 1800s. They were literally skeletons walking around, because they would force them to grow all of the harvest and take all of it as the taxations and left the farmers starving. So when we talk about the poverty of Bharat at that time, is not often you'll see professors blame the Hindu culture as being the reason, saying that you have a caste system, that you have a backwards, impoverished Hindu dharma that you call as your religion, and it's because of that is why you are famished and impoverished. That still continues today. I looked up National Geographic's social studies textbook, and it still has pictures of poor Indians in the middle of like trash, saying that it's because of their religion, even though it has the most fertile land, It's the most impoverished country in the world. Why? Because of the looting that has happened. So that's just one example. But for thousands of years, it's this invasions that have come over and over again that has left the people in a subjugated state of mind. And so again, Swami Vivekananda arose at this time to reinvigorate the Hindu culture. There was a story that a teacher came up to him and said, "Oh, Swami Vivekananda, please, I want to take sannyasa. Please give it to me." And he said, "Sure. I will touch your head, and you will also get sannyasa, and you can attain moksha. But there's one thing you have to do for me before you do." He said, "Okay, anything." He said, "Go to Banaras, buy 2 Banarasi saris, go to London, and sell it there." Swamiji, if I sold everything that I had, I could maybe buy 2 saris, but how am I supposed to get to London? He said, "If you want sannyasa and moksha and you can't do this, how can you achieve that?" He said, but how do I reach? And he said, "Well, take the 2 saris, tie them up, put it on your head, start walking northwest." He said, "But the Bay of Bengal is in the way." He's like, "Then start swimming." The point is, Swami Vivekananda's message was, in this time of need, work. Work to have swarajya. When you can attain that, then you're eligible for moksha. If that baseline quality of human life is not there, you're not set up to reach even higher. If your foundations are shaky, then you cannot reach the highest pole. It will topple over. So even in Vivek Chudamani, the very first verse that is given is, first, develop that strength within you, then become a Bharatiya. Uphold dharma in such a valorous way that no one can question where you stand. Only then are you qualified to even enter the Vedic literature. So compare what Hinduism looked like back in the Vedic periods, then the Puranic periods, and now the last 1,000 years. Today we're still struggling. How do we teach our own children to be Hindus? That's still a question today. And so Hariji, Swamiji, and I have to think of movie workshops, chick camps, to connect with the students, because we're matching what do the students need at this time to get them to connect back to the roots. So this is the most important element of Hinduism, is the fact that it has this first principle that the very essence of Sanatana Dharma is apurusheya, that it comes from the source that it itself is Sanatana. But at the same time, it does not remain rigid. It is able to adapt its eternal principles to apply to each society in the time, in the place that it is, so that they can continue to connect back to the Upanishadic essence in their own way. But never compromise that fundamentals for convenience. Because today what we do is flip that around. Oh, it's Hinduism, it can adapt, it's so encompassing, we could do whatever we want, we can attain moksha. No. Yes, there's flexibility, but there is guidelines. There is a foundation that we're reaching to. And in fact, today, we start to see a lot of these Western historians, politicians, the media, twist the fact that it is flexible to say that it is all-encompassing. And to say that it keeps changing doesn't mean that there's any validity to your religion. That any time Hinduism comes to a low, they will twist that and say that is because of your religion. Anytime it comes back up, it's saying, oh, this was borrowed ideas, and so we helped you revive yourself. So we need to come back to our foundations and understand what is fundamental and unchanging, and what is flexible and adaptable. Which brings us to what was the time in which Adi Shankaracharya ji was in. Right before Adi, this is around the 7th century. Some say he was born in 782. Some say maybe 100 years before, but 6th, 7th centuries when he's dated to have been born. So prior to this, what was the scene? What was the troubles that the people were going through? And what did Hinduism look like at that time? So Buddhism was a huge factor and a huge proponent at this point in time. Why? Because prior to Buddhism, this fanatical ritualism was spreading widespread. And people didn't understand why they were doing. They didn't have any deeper meaning to what they were doing. People were just doing it because they had to. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? As times really changed. But this was, and each Pandit wanted to become a proponent leader for themselves. Again, that doesn't sound very different, right? We have all these gurus on YouTube saying that I'm the best and trying to gain followers. I was shocked as I was reading. I was like, have times really changed? But that blind ritualism, that factions within, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shakti Marga. In fact, Shakti Marga had now taken on a sense of mysticism, right? And ritualism, Mimamsas, they were all taking on the persona of being ritualistic. So as a rebellion against this it didn't make sense to the people at that point. It was too superstitious and too rigid. It didn't make sense to the people anymore. And therefore we saw the rise of Buddhism that went and started to question what you're interpreting as the Vedas, is that even correct? So Buddhism had taken on quite a bit of popularity. In fact, in the 7th century, 82% of the population were Buddhists. And so because the people followed, therefore the leaderships, the kings, would also follow. And so we see in our history that there were Buddhist kings that were ruling over Bharat at that time. It was a strong movement. And so these Hindu Pandits who were fighting against each other, said, okay, now the incomes have changed. We need to shift and rearrange. And so they joined Buddhism as well. And so just as we see cycles, Buddhism also had its peak and it also had its decline. It was in the 6th and 7th century that we see just how bad Buddhism had declined too. These Pandits who had now converted to Buddhism had brought their clashing, and so Gurudev has a really interesting portrayal of what it was like to be understanding Buddhism at that time. One person would go to a satsang hall with one Buddhist Pandit, and for about 50 minutes, all he would be saying is why the other 9 out of the 10 were completely wrong and how his way was the right way, and be debunking all the other 9. But by 55 minutes, he needs to wrap up everything, so he never has time to actually proclaim why is his way the correct way. So the guy moves on, says, okay, fine, all the other 9 are fools, this one seems to be right, great. 2 days later, he goes to a different satsang by a different Pandit, and this Pandit now says, the other 9 out of 10 are fools, here's why, for 50 minutes, and again doesn't have time to explain why his was a great proponent. And therefore this guy, by like the 10th satsang, realizes that each and every Pandit is a fool and therefore Buddhism is foolish. And on a more practical terms, you can start to see that pattern in the way Buddhism was being taught. A lot of their principles was about breaking down why Vedic lines of thinking were inaccurate. That Shunyavada was the proponent that they had. That when we talk about moksha, it is this no-mind state. And that the definition of a jiva is that it is a series of thoughts. What happens when the series of thoughts end? I'm just giving you a very superficial understanding of Buddhism, but there was a lot of, at that point, negating each other more than asserting principles. So at this point, if anyone were living in Bharat, you have Buddhism that is not leading anywhere. You have the last remaining Hindus that are fighting amongst each other to see who's the best. Is Shiva the best or is Bhagavan Krishna the best? Then you have Shaktiism, where it's now started to take on this weird mystical tantric like voodoo magic at this point. And so everyone is turned off at this point, and this is the low that Hinduism saw at that point in time. So again, the vitality of the culture is such that at times of need, it will, as Gurudev says it, throws up a hero that acts as the antibodies to fight against all the decaying tendencies of that time. And so Adi Shankaracharya ji was born. He was 8 years old. 8 years. He's what? If you were to put it in terms of, I had to think about this for a second. What exactly does an 8-year-old look like? He's probably what, a second grader, third grader? A second grader and a third grader decides to leave home from Kerala and walk all the way to Ganga to find his guru. An 8-year-old, we see like all these videos today, you know, when they get upset that they don't have dino nuggies or something, whatever, right? Jalapeno peppers, I don't know, whatever. So you get, they throw tantrums and say, I'm leaving home, and you just have to laugh. It's too adorable. But here's Adi Shankaracharya ji, who's 8 years old, saying that I am ready for sannyasa, and leaves and walks all the way to Ganga to find his guru. The guru is Govindacharya ji. He sees this little boy, and he, being a Mahatma, immediately recognizes that this is a great hero in the making for Sanatana Dharma, and he recognizes that here's a Mahatma standing in front of me. He said, all these other people say I'm crazy for agreeing to give you sannyasa, but I see greatness in you. And so he agrees that for Adi Shankaracharya ji to take sannyasa. And a little while later, this little 8-year-old boy comes up to his guru and says, may I write commentaries on the Upanishad? Do you even know how to spell Upanishad? And he said, listen, if I tell you go ahead and write Upanishads, all these other pundits will kill me. Okay, they think I'm going to be crazy. Before you get there, do one thing for me. Take Vishnu Sahasranama and write commentary on that. Govindacharya ji figured, okay, this will be enough of a challenge that this kid will keep his head down for the next 20 years. And when he's 28, then, okay, maybe we can give him the job that he's asked for. Within 24 hours, Adi Shankaracharya ji lays down a manuscript at his guru's feet and says, Guru, here's what you've asked for. His guru said, okay, maybe this is 12, 20 names out of, the 1,000 names in Vishnu Sahasranama. Okay, fine, I'll take a read to it. Next day he sits down and he starts looking at it, and he's engrossed. Such depth of meaning for each name. And he's taken so many references from Upanishad to substantiate every claim that he's made. So this is an important value, that anytime you make a claim or an interpretation, it has to be valid by the Upanishads, by the Vedas. Vedas are our pramana. And like water, he's just giving references upon references in the exact place that's necessary to validate his commentary for each and every single name in the thousands of names of Vishnu Sahasranama. The guru was baffled and said, I am not the guru. He's the guru and I'm the disciple. There's so much here that I'm learning. he's definitely showcased his skillful mastery over the Upanishad. The next day, he said, Adi Shankaracharya ji, my guru, go ahead, write the commentaries on Upanishad. And Adi Shankaracharya ji is not just Bhagwan, because we treat Adi Shankaracharya ji as Bhagwan Shiva himself. Of course, because the very essence of Bhagwan, the very essence of Hinduism, the very essence of the heroes and Mahatmas that it produces are one and the same, of course. But here is a Mahatma. Let's look at him as a historical figure, as a hero, as a man. He is the most perfect man of Hinduism that could ever have been produced. Because at this time, he's able to challenge Mandana Mishra and each of his disciples before were great advocates in themselves. They were great intellectuals. In fact, Sureshwaracharya ji, before he became his disciple, was the very one who was able to defeat Buddhism in every intellectual way. He's written so many works to negate the fallacies of Buddhism at that point. To such an intellectual, a 12-year-old boy is able to convince him that Advaita Siddhanta is the flawless Siddhanta that needs to be followed. And it's not, of course, all that vigor of intellectualism is there. But here's a 12-year-old boy sitting down, talking to this great intellectual scholar and explaining, look, this is a flaw that's here. How can you come to this conclusion? This is a valid way. In the most gentle but profound way, he's able to convert even Swami Sureshwaracharya ji. So for great intellectuals, he's able to tackle them. That's what the Brahma Sutras did. He went through all the Upanishads. For every apparent confusion or contradiction, he's thoroughly explained it in all of his commentaries in Brahma Sutras. But if he only handled the elite, Hinduism would not have survived today. He has that large-heartedness to reach to every single mindset. If there are those students, those children of Vedanta who want to enter the doors, he has written the most basic textbooks, Tattva Bodha, Atma Bodha, Viveka Chudamani. And even then you can see his literary skills. Tattva Bodha is not the same as Atma Bodha. Atma Bodha is very different from Vivek Chudamani. Tattva Bodha has a question and answer style that, we have to by heart in the beginning of our any exams or any curriculum, right? So there's that style. Atma Bodha is full of analogies. Any analogy you can think of that's classical to Vedanta will be found in Atma Bodha. And Vivek Chudamani, if there's one textbook you need to explain everything that you need to about Hinduism, Vivek Chudamani is the one textbook. So for students and children of Vedanta, he's able to cater to them. For those that don't really have that intellectual capacity and live by their heart, he's captured them as well. His poetry in every single stotram that he has. For bhaktas of each Bhagwan and each Devi, he's given an entire commentary on the Leelas. For every heart. And one of the Swamijis describes an amazing example. That when we look at the very two first stotrams that are in our book of hymns on Ganeshji, Ganesha Pancharatna and Ganesha Stava, Ajam Nirvikalpam Nirakarameham. And so the entire verse is simply Advaita Vedanta. Why? Because probably at one point he walked into a temple and saw all these scholars debating about their favorite Ganeshji, and he's able to uplift their mind through their devotion of Ganeshji up to the highest. At the same time, if he walked into a temple and saw children's playing and, making fun of Ganeshji, eating the modakas, he connected with them as well. Mudakarata modakam. He's describing, the modakas in his hand, the big belliedness of Ganeshji, his huge ears. And he's even able to capture their hearts as well. Administratively, he's walked 13 times through entire Bharat and able to establish 4 main mathas so that if he passes away, this Sanatana Dharma will still be standing on the 4 pillars. And he's written an entire text on how to effectively administrate. So if you're a manager or getting into the management line, he's an amazing scholar to study as well. How do you run mathas? How do you sustain this institution and religion over time? So, Adi Shankaracharya Ji is like both the father and the mother. The father who has that strength and valor within him to uphold the entire family, to bring what that family needs. And yet he's also the mother who knows how to make a potato dish for the baby that barely has teeth, for the teenager that's having a little bit of a rebellious moment that wants, French fries, or the husband that has his own particular tastes that come from his side of the family, so she has to make parathas his way. So Adi Shankaracharya Ji is not just Bhagwan, but he's the most perfect hero of Hinduism, who is both our mother and our father. And so for those that may not have yet entered a connection with Hinduism, whether it's through the heart or whether it's through the mind, maybe we're still living in our Vyavaharic life and busy with our day-to-day lives. Even for them, he's now given us Bhaja Govindam. He gives us the most practical, pragmatic mirror to sit in front of our face to analyze our own life by. Every aspect, every relationship that we can possibly think of, he has addressed in this. And again, it's not just with a hammer, but he's done it in such a melodious way that we call it a bouquet. So this Bhaja Govindam is made of 31 verses. The first one, of course, is the chorus that is often repeated. Then I believe the first 12 are given by Adi Shankaracharya Ji. Each one is like a bouquet. Each one is like a bouquet, and yet a hammer that beats through our own misconceptions about every relationship that we have. And because of that strength, depth, and beauty of what he had to say, the next, I believe, 14 come from his disciples. And each one is like the gem produced by Adi Shankaracharya Ji. Their verses are no less. In fact, so much so that it re-inspired Adi Shankaracharya Ji to give the last couple verses of this Bhaja Govindam. So, Moha Mudgara, the one that smashes our delusions. And it is, I'm forgetting the Sanskritam word for this. I think it's called Manjira. I believe that's the word. Manjira is the Sanskritam word for bouquet. So each section that I just went through, each one is called as a manjira. But at the end of the day, that chorus rings over and over again in our heads. Bhaja Govindam, Govindam Bhaja, O Mudhamate. And therefore, we also call this text as Bhaja Govindam. So, I believe we will end here. Next class, we will head straight into the chorus of this, and we will pick up verse by verse going forward. And hopefully we can remember the foundations of Sanatana Dharma, that no matter where we are, that is our goal, and that it has its way of guiding us to it. And because of its vitality, it has given us guru after guru after guru. And right now, our guru, our mother, and our father is Adi Shankaracharya Ji. And hopefully, by looking into the mirror of ourselves in Bhaja Govindam, we'll come out of this text being a little bit more stable inside, a little bit more courageous to tackle whatever's inside, and have the strength to become a better Hindu, not just for myself, not just for my family and my children, but for society and the nation and the future ahead of us. That capacity is within us. So with that, let's do closing prayers. Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shantihi Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om. Thank you so much. And again, if there's anyone who would like to volunteer, there are many different roles that we can ask you to fulfill, and that seva will be very helpful to us going forward. So again, reach out to Rameshji, or you can come to me